136 years ago, in 1882, when the Reverend George Leonard Chaney first came to Atlanta, it was just a lot of dirt. And by that I mean the prospect for liberal religion. The Civil War had ended only 17 years earlier, and Atlanta as a southern city was decidedly unfriendly soil for the seeds of Unitarianism, with its strong anti-slavery views. There had been other attempts to plant Unitarian congregations in Georgia. In 1827, a church in Augusta had been gathered, but it experienced, as one writer memorably put it, strangulation. After 1856, it was no longer listed in the yearbook of Unitarian churches. Then there was the church in Savannah, gathered in 1831. It flourished for a time, but it too disappeared from the roster of Unitarian churches, this one by the end of the Civil War. Today, both congregations are alive and well, but the decades following the Civil War were bad, bad times. And then there was this. Between the years 1877 and 1900, an average of 190 lynchings annually in Georgia and other states. The Ku Klux Klan was in full force of terror. That's what the Reverend George Leonard Chaney faced when he came to Atlanta. Colleagues were warning him, telling him, waste of time. But I want you to think of the Dixie cups of dirt that children are given in their religious education classes to demonstrate the miracle of life. They are told to water the dirt and be patient and see what happens. Just so, the Reverend Chaney. He watered his little cup of dirt faithfully. He believed that his cause would eventually prevail. Once he was in Atlanta, he made arrangements for his first service. It would take place February 19, 1882, in the old Kimball House. He located all the known Unitarian families in the area, posted advertisements in the newspapers, did all the things that you're wanting to do when you're wanting to plant a new congregation. And guess how many showed up? 2. A Mrs. W.S. Morrill, the history record shows, a Mrs. W.S. Morrill and a Miss E.E. College. 2 people among all the many possible tens of thousands of people in Atlanta. Reverend Chaney's next address was entitled The Positive Principles of Unitarian Christianity, and 3 more people showed up, bringing his audience to a whopping total of 5. No one who was not already a convinced Unitarian. This went on for 6 months, he says. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness and awakening few responses beyond its own echo. It's like that beautiful old Taoist story of the farmer whose horse ran away. His neighbors heard the news, they come running, and they share their condolences. Such bad luck, they say. But the farmer replies, maybe. Do you know that story? Maybe. Reverend Chaney, our spiritual ancestor, had faith. To the naked eye, things were not looking good at all, but he walked by faith and not by sight. He kept on. He trusted his vision of Unitarianism flourishing in Atlanta, and he had faith that it was not all up to himself and all his efforts. The people would come, and the hidden power of life that he called God was active in this world. Life hidden in what is ordinary and unlikely, like dirt in a Dixie cup. It would stir and it would grow in its own good time. 1 year later, in 1883, a new congregation was founded with not 2 or 5 people, but 27 charter members called the Church of Our Father. A building was built. The young congregation found ways of walking the talk. Atlanta, had a young men's library with 12,000 volumes, but it was private. And you could use it only if you paid a fee. But what if you couldn't afford it? And forget about even trying if you were a woman or a person of color. There was need for a free lending library because Unitarianism affirmed the value of the mind in religion, and all minds matter. The lending library should be a library for everyone, male or female, black or white, poor or wealthy. Paul, in the Christian scriptures, talked about how there was neither slave nor free, neither female nor male, neither Jew nor Gentile, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And our ancestor congregation took on the task of incarnating these prophetic words practically, entrepreneurially, in establishing the lending library of their dreams. Eventually, the Carnegie Foundation got wind of this, saw how successful this venture was, and was inspired to establish no less than the current Atlanta Public Library. It's just like the next part of that old Taoist story. The next morning, the horse that ran away returned, bringing with it 3 new horses. The neighbors come running. "How wonderful!" they exclaimed. "Maybe," said the farmer, because life has ups and downs. Cling to only what is happening in the moment, right before your eyes, and you cannot flow with life. Life is an ever-changing stream. Following the founding of the Church of Our Father in 1883 and up to the late 1940s, what we find is a congregation that is muddling along. Some ups, but mostly downs, with a membership roll that never exceeds 50 people. It struggled financially. The Reverend Bob Carnan describes this rather frankly. He says, the members of the Atlanta church were, according to my readings of the financial records, a very cheap bunch. They constantly begged the American Unitarian Association for money to subsidize the operation. Yet they never supported it very well themselves. Contributions of $5 per year were quite normal. Finally, in 1908, the president of the American Unitarian Association, Samuel Eliot, he wrote the Atlanta members a letter outlining their organizational mismanagement, their sense of entitlement to be bailed out, and their inability to keep a minister longer than 3 years. Most left after 1 year. Dr. Eliot told them to fish or cut bait. Choose death or choose life. Well, you can't get any clearer than that. But our ancestor congregation continued muddling along anyway. It was lost, born of a vision of serving all people, whatever their race and gender and class, and on, as the Free Lending Library Initiative so wonderfully incarnated. But somehow, the vision was forgotten, and the congregation found itself caught up in the drudge work of institutional maintenance, caught up in inwardness, caught up in dramas of all types. They were challenged to be scrappy, but they kept on dropping the S to that word. If you know what I mean. If you're not laughing, think about it a little bit longer. This is what led to the merger of Atlanta Unitarians with Atlanta Universalists in 1918, together with a new name, the United Liberal Church of Atlanta. We were the very first Unitarian Universalist congregation in history, a full 43 years before the two parent denominations formally came together in 1961. It sounds exciting, but again, the historical reality is disillusioning. Says one of our interim ministers in 1940, Frederick W. Perkins, the merger was prompted more by a desire to offset the weakness of each then by a large-minded devotion to a common spiritual objective which was bigger than either, to which each could contribute its distinctive gifts, and with which they could serve better together than apart. Furthermore, the Unitarian group was largely of an urban type. The Universalist group was one of rural backgrounds coming from small communities in Georgia and elsewhere. They have never, except in the case of large-minded individuals on both sides, gotten much beyond the stage of viewing each other with distinguished consideration. And not always that. All of which explains why our ancestor congregation back in 1918 and beyond was idiosyncratic. I just want to stress every syllable there, idiosyncratic. Universalists sat on one side of the aisle. Unitarians sat on the other side of the aisle. A Universalist usually held the treasurer's post, while a Unitarian usually became president of the board. If the present minister was Unitarian, you better believe the next one, Universalist. Back and forth like a weird game of tennis. Back and forth, back and forth. All drama, power plays, controversies, intrigues. And no issue provoked more of it than that of integration. In the fall of 1947, the minister at the time, Reverend Isaiah Domas, invited Dr. Thomas Baker Jones, a friend and colleague from Atlanta University, who also happened to be black, to attend services. Soon after, the Ku Klux Klan were hounding Reverend Domas and his family at their home. His daughter remembers peeking out of her windows, peeking down 2 floors below, where she saw a convoy of battered cars and rusty pickup trucks stretched from 3rd Street to Ponce de Leon. Each was full of Klansmen in white robes, tilting back their pointed heads to hunt for motion behind their window drapes. Much later, she asked her mother if her parents had been scared, and her mother replied, "We were too angry to be scared. Your father was not about to let a bunch of bigoted nincompoops tell him what to do." Yeah. Unfortunately, the Reverend Domas encountered bigoted nincompoops within the congregation he served. Dr. Thomas Baker Jones had applied for membership in the church. A formal vote of the congregation was called on for December 5th, 1947. 21 members voted to exclude the Negro from all church functions that I am just quoting. 21 members. 15 opposed the measure, and the rest, as UUCA member and Unitarian Universalist historian J. Kiskell writes, declined to cast a ballot in the best hush-my-mouth Southern tradition. This spelled doom for the United Liberal Church of Atlanta. Reverend Domas resigned. The American Unitarian Association blacklisted the congregation and urged that no Unitarian minister serve it, and the Universalist Church of America did the same. Our ancestor congregation dug in its heels, and then in 1951, the American Unitarian Association, which owned the building and practically everything else because the congregation was a cheap bunch, sold the building out from under them to, get this, the very conservative Bible Research Foundation. Was the dirt in our Dixie cup bone dry and the seeds of Unitarian Universalism dead? Maybe. But life is flowing. Life is an ever-changing stream, and every new generation gets its new shot. 1 year later, in 1952, the American Unitarian Association commissioned the Reverend Glenn Canfield to create a Phoenix miracle and rebirth the failed congregation. The commitment, unequivocal, right from the start, was to a vision of human and civil rights. There was always drama in congregational life. There was always necessary institutional maintenance, always the natural tendency towards inwardness, but Reverend Canfield's steady hands put the horse before the cart and established us on a firm foundation of vision. If you had an order of service from that era, this is one of the things you would read in it. Our fellowship includes all people, regardless of race, color, nationality, or station of life. We believe in the essential humanity, the essential unity of humanity, and only together can we work out successful ways of living in happiness and in peace. Reverend Canfield brought vision like this, and so did his successor, the Reverend Ed Cahill, and all of a sudden, the congregation that never went beyond 50 folks shot up to more than 100 members and beyond. We believe in the essential of humanity, and only together can we work out successful ways of living in happiness and peace. The congregation lived that. For example, in the early 60s, Coretta Scott King was leader of the youth group at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and our congregation and theirs arranged joint Sunday evening programs, alternating between them so black and white young people could get to know one another. The Klan called and threatened violence at the next youth meeting. Congregation officials consulted with Coretta Scott King regarding the options, and she said, "Go ahead with that meeting." All parents were given the option of keeping their children home. Not one parent held back. That evening, all of the fathers came, and they ringed that church from the outside to form a visible wall of protection. These are true hero moments, are they not? So many stories like this, vision becoming real. You don't just pledge $5 a year to something like that. You throw money at that. You throw your time at that. You throw your energy at that because it is changing lives in ways that no one can deny. People in this generation, the generation when civil rights was the central galvanizing social issue, they watered the cup of their dirt faithfully, and the seed grew, and who would have known that seed would have turned out to have been that of a redwood? In 1974, at the end of the pastorate of the Reverend Eugene Pickett, the congregation that was stuck at 50 for so many years would be at 1,040 people, marking it the largest congregation in the Unitarian Universalist Association. In 1966, the congregation moved to this location here at Cliff Valley, and for 52 years, it has found ways to walk the talk and serve Atlanta and the world. The ministers present before you, whose ministries have been formed and nurtured in important ways by this congregation, they witness to this truth. How we launched Northwest Unitarian Universalist Congregation. How we were integral to the launch of the Mountain Retreat and Learning Center in North Carolina. Our work with Planned Parenthood in the 1970s, and our support of a family planning clinic. Our years serving at Cascade House, a shelter for homeless women and men. Many of you may not know this about our history. Our Metro Ministry Community Service Program, led by Joe Chansey, right there, serving people affected by the AIDS crisis in the mid-'80s into the 90s. All our mentors working in inner-city Hope Hill Elementary School classrooms, that started in 1994. It will continue on. So much has happened in our 52 years of being in this space. Our lay ministry program started in 1996 under the leadership of the Reverend Diana Jordan Allende. Where is she? Where is she? There she is right there. The Underground Theater, longest-running theatrical group in Atlanta history. The UUCA Art Gallery, the longest-running gallery, it's an echo in here, in Atlanta history. That's one of the women who started that thing right there. Ins and outs. the Peace Network, Promise the Children, all the classes, all the programs, all the small groups, all the meals, all the parties, all the meetings. All the children who grew up in our religious education classes, who were handed their own Dixie cups of dirt. And they learned about the mystery and surpassing wonder of life, who were dedicated here, came of age here, went to youth group here, were loved and supported in their growing up here. And each of us as individuals, representing our own Dixie cup. And this place has watered us faithfully, and we have grown here. We have grown here. And starting next Sunday, not here. Another place. Temporary space we're calling. And when it's ready, the permanent space on North Druid Hills. So, is this when the neighbors in the old Taoist story come running, yelling, "It's a disaster"? Is that when? We must walk by faith and not by sight. You look around you, you see no hymnals. As Don mentioned, they've already been packed. You look around this building, the walls are bare. You look around you, you see stacks and boxes and detritus. But we must walk by faith and not by sight. The same sort of faith that Reverend George Leonard Chaney had when he came to Atlanta in 1882 to plant Unitarian seeds in southern soil. The same sort of faith that strengthened Reverend Domus in 1947 to invite the wrong kind of people to church and therefore serve the cause of love and justice. The same sort of faith that has strengthened all the ministers, all the leaders, all the volunteers since. And we must keep our history in mind. The golden moments, of course, but especially the lead ones. Growth is not inevitable. As we saw with our ancestor congregation roughly between 1890 and the late 1940s, we have the capacity to muddle along. We have the capacity to get ensnared by dramas and inwardness, and the S just keeps on falling away from that word, scrappy. It's just part of us. We can tap into that as surely as we can tap into all the great stuff, the hero stuff that is there. We can starve this congregation, or we can feed it. We can falter in the face of the big spiritual and social challenges of our day, or we can step forward in prophetic witness and incarnate love and justice as best as we know how. We can make decisions that in the moment seem expedient and wise, but they are in truth fear-based and small-minded. Or we can make decisions that are courageous and truly needed in service to the bold spiritual call of becoming more than we ever thought was possible. The Reverend George Leonard Chaney came to Atlanta in 1882, and pretty much everyone considered it a lost cause, wasted effort. Only 2 people showed up for his first address, 5 for the second. "I'm like a voice crying out in the wilderness," he once said. But he kept on crying out, and he found a way. And through the power of faith, he bore up the mystery of the reality of his day and time, and we were born. He was bold then. We need to be bold now. Amen.